Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. As always, my name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today with me is Matt Summers. He's the Global Vice President of Culture and Leadership at the NeuroLeadership Institute. We'll talk about the NeuroLeadership Institute a little bit later, but I want to start, Matt, by asking, how does remote work increase productivity from your perspective, from what you've seen with your clients?
Yeah, thank you, Gleb. So what's really interesting, this is such a critical question at this time in the post-pandemic era. So what we're seeing are real opportunities. I'm calling it a true transformation, or really a revolution for leaders in organizations to change their perspective on how they see not only themselves, but their employees, as you know, through that lens of person-first perspective, especially in the hybrid workplace realities we face now. So what I mean by this is, I think there's a real opportunity for us to build greater in-groups to start with, right? To build greater human connection that maybe we didn't even have when we were all working in the workplace pre-pandemic. There's a solid piece of research that shows us that now more than ever, the brain is craving certainty. The brain is craving human connection and relatedness to other humans around us, even when we're in this place of isolation, and more so than we've ever experienced as a species, really. Yeah. Now, I'll also build on that. So there's some other opportunities that hybrid realities are presenting. One of them, too, is the rate at which we can make decisions effectively. So we can use technology to our advantage to not only feel connected to others, but actually make efficient and quick decisions that are high optimized quality decisions if we use new habits and if we leverage the technology in a meaningful way. And I could talk a bit more about that later on. The final piece is, hybrid reality is also building this opportunity for not just leaders, but all employees to future-proof their skill sets in working outside of the workplace. So we actually require as humans, and there's a lot of science and a lot of psychology at play, neurobiology at play here, Gleb, that says that we as human beings need to future-proof, anticipate what not just this year looks like, but what do the next 5 years look like for us in this hybrid reality? And part of that is being able to manage what we call in the brain a distance bias gap, right? And so there's an opportunity to mitigate and to reduce this distance bias in this particular region of our brain that processes and values people and things that we perceive to be closer to us, right? So if you and I, Gleb, used to work in the office together and our offices were side by side, we could just tap each other on the shoulder and get input and different perspectives and ideation going, right? However, in the pandemic era, now you and I are working from home, we're working on the same projects in the same company. This presents an opportunity for you and I to connect in different ways, to generate insights together in unique and different ways using different apps, AI technology, not just the simple platform of something like Zoom or Microsoft Teams when we're in this reality. It's also forcing us to learn more about other human beings intentionally. So the opportunity in hybrid workplace realities, human connection, is it's forcing employees and leaders alike to change the whole platform of interaction. And what I mean by that is the frequency through which we can interact with others is now increasing. And the fluency for understanding each other is increasing too. So the opportunity here, Gleb, is that we can connect with more people, more widely, more globally at the same time, when being in the office presented some environmental challenges to that reality historically. And so we've evolved just in the last 3 years as a species, and we've been forced to do that at an accelerated rate. So there's a number of these opportunities that are showing up for us to provide more certainty, to speak to the why we're doing something before we get into the what and the how, and for us to better manage uncertainty in the brain when we're leading others through project work, when we're making decisions, and finally, to really be more consciously intentional to mitigate those unconscious biases that we're relying on in these uncertain times of the pandemic that enable us to really understand other people's processes for making decisions, their perspectives for making decisions, so that we can co-create better decision making, right?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And so when you talked about the distance between people, I think what you're speaking of is what I talked about in my Harvard Business Review article as the proximity bias, where when people are are proximate to each other, they have a liking for each other. And that, of course, goes back to from the evolutionary psychology of tribalism, where we are evolved, our brains are evolved to be tribal. And so intuitively, we don't connect nearly as well on squares on a Zoom screen as we connect in the office. And so it's very easy for people who spend more time in the office to be seen as better, more likable, a closer member of our tribe. Now, I talked about this in my book, Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, and I helped 21 organizations transition to hybrid and remote work. And this proximity bias is a big, big challenge. What I found works to address it is to make sure that managers don't just have the once annual quarterly performance review, but have a series of performance reviews every week during their one-on-ones, which they already do anyway if they're good managers, with their team members, that they integrate a performance review element of that so they can know where each of their team members is. Each of their team members knows where they are and their standing, and that they can actually more objectively evaluate team members as opposed to fall into that proximity bias and just evaluate those who are closer to them in the office more positively. So let's dive into that. Are there any other techniques that you might think about from your perspective that can help address proximity bias, that distance gap of what you talked about?
Yeah, Gleb, this is closely tied to relatedness and connection with others in this hybrid reality. And so some of the techniques we teach our global clients across multiple industries is building simple habits, right? We focus here at the NLI on habit adoption, habit building through new behaviors. And that's some of the simple habits I would recommend is tuning into things like emotional and cognitive and behavioral empathy, right? So really having a perspective-taking approach to understanding other people's experience. In the modern post-pandemic era, Gleb, what I'm noticing now is our brains have got caught in this trap of survival, right? And so part of that survival predictable response is the distance bias influencing our interactions with other humans. And so what we want to do is we ultimately want to establish, I would say equitable is the word, equitable processes where employees feel deeply valued, right? So if somebody can't be on camera, let's all be off camera, right? If somebody, the goal is obviously to all be on camera in hybrid realities, and we explain why, because we can still monitor in the brain the micro behaviors that you're eliciting as I speak to you, right?
Sure.
I tell my students at the university I work at, that I teach at, that those micro behaviors are those little signals that give our brains that next step on the interaction. And so how we interpret or misinterpret them can really influence how we feel that sense of relatedness, that sense of connectedness, and how we mitigate that distance bias. Here's the other piece to keep in mind. The distance bias is also physical, right? So if I know that you're in a different time zone to me, if I know that you're in a different country to me, or in a different space within the project, like in a different stage of the project, I'm going to create unconsciously an in-group for you or an out-group. And so part of the strategy is to mitigate this illusion of in-group or out-group. So what I want to do is I want to create in-group with as many people as possible. And so the strategy I use here with my own team at NLI, and then we recommend this that our clients try this, and that is to look for the common ground with every employee in your project or within your team or within your organization where possible. And what that means is to close the distance bias gap, have visual prompts that can activate that visual occipital lobe at the back of the brain that help us to remember things, human traits about a person we're going to be working with for a long time. So if I'm meeting you for the first time today, Gleb, and we're going to be working on a project within our organization, as an example, and you are diving straight into the details of work, what we could do is we could do a 180 degrees on that. And we could start by telling us, each other a bit about ourselves, about our personal lives, learning a bit about maybe your hobbies, your interests. And by doing so, we're finding common ground and we're building unconsciously in group as a bias, which serves us when we interact. It also activates a whole different system in the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, right at the front of the brain. Now, you're familiar with this region of the brain, but what it does for those that are listening is that when we can access and activate circuitry in this medial prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain, we can activate collaborative circuitry, right? So that closes the distance bias gap. We can activate our objective social circuitry, where we are not subjective in the way we react to each other's responses, but more importantly, we can consider each other's responses. We can perspective take. We can, at NLI, we call this tuning in to not only my experience, but your experience too, especially when we're not in the same office together and we're on a platform like hybrid reality, right?
Yeah. I think that sort of really valuable points, kind of the empathy. One of the things that you want to think about is who takes responsibility for doing so. So when I consult for companies on this question, one of the biggest challenges is in habit change is that it's the ordinary employees regularly, they don't really change their habits. It has to be leaders. So for example, one of the activities I have leaders do is for their, let's say, a rank and file team leader, lower level supervisor of 6 to 8 people. And what I have them do is start each day to create a personal channel on Slack or Microsoft Teams for their team, just for personal discussions. And start each morning with a prompt saying, how's your day going so far? How's your private life? What do you plan to focus on at work this day? And share one fact about yourself or the world that others don't know. Which, of course, the function of that is exactly what you're talking about, Matt, to build that sense of connection and to help people feel like they're human beings, even when they don't see each other. For example, this could be for a hybrid team who come into the office a couple of days a week. This could be for a fully remote team who never come into the office. This also works well for distributed teams. So when one of my clients, for example, is a Fortune 200 high-tech manufacturer called Applied Materials, who let me talk about their work. And they have distributed teams around the globe, and they find that this technique is quite helpful for them. But one of the things that leaders find a challenge is that they always have to prompt their team members to do so because it's an artificial habit. It's not something that comes naturally. This is a virtual water cooler conversation. And so how do you help leaders accept and value the importance of building these artificial new habits, novel habits in this hybrid world in which we find ourselves?
It's such an important question, Gleb. And, somebody asked me this a couple of months ago when I was talking to a CEO of a banking business. And it was fascinating because we have to break the pattern of human behavior that we're seeing in the post-pandemic era, where leaders and employees alike in organizations are experiencing so much change, Gleb, right? There's a lot of change going on in organizations, which means there's a lot of turbulence in the system in organizations, which also means there's a lot of uncertainty, not only in leaders' brains, but employees' brains. The reason why I mention this is because we want to come back to this piece of this refocus, this revolution of breaking human-centric mediocrity. And so as leaders, we need to upskill leaders and refocus the focus of leaders to reprioritize what we're calling human-centric practices, right? That can break that cycle of mediocrity. Now, it's too easy for employees and leaders to hide within the shadows of post-pandemic mediocrity because of their human unconscious biases, the way we predictably respond before the pandemic. The post-pandemic era is literally a whole new map for us in organizations and as leaders. So what I would recommend for leaders to do, first of all, is to adapt to that new map, those new skill sets, to build a common language. So the research shows that when you are adapting to change, which everybody now in reality is build a common language between the manager, the employees, and between the employees and the employees, between the managers and the managers, peer-to-peer, direct report to leader. And so having a common language for how are you going to make decisions? What is your meeting etiquette? How are we going to connect frequently? How do we tap someone on the shoulder virtually and connect with them through Slack or through Messenger or whatever it is to build that connection with each other? And so this common language and the frequency of using that common language is going to be critically important as opposed to a leader who goes through a new education program, learns a new skill set, and then throws these new words out to their team members, right, sporadically in meetings, when that team member has no context as to what that new jargon means, what the new process is trying to achieve. So that leads me to the second piece here, Gleb, and that is, I think we need to get better as leaders in an organization at recalibrating the why we're doing something. So we're moving so fast in organizations. And in my interviews with CHROs, what I see from them is this urgency to, the business's urgency to demonstrate to customers their effectiveness, to hit deadlines, to produce new products, that we've lost sight of the human being behind that engine, right? And so by doing so, what we've done is we've lost sight of the ability to co-create, the ability to connect more frequently, the ability to hear and listen to other perspectives. It reminds me of an interview that I did with Dr. Amy Edmondson out of Harvard Business School. And this was 3 years ago. And I said to her, look, we've got a lot of listeners live and who are saying in the pandemic era, what should leaders be focusing on? And she said, all my years of research are showing that right now, leaders need to get better at listening to understand rather than listening to respond. So how often, Gleb, just you as a human being, me as a human being, just in the last 7 days, how many meetings have you and I attended where we're listening to respond, right? So we're just reloading our response for what's important to us as a priority. And it sounds logical and easy, but cognitively, it's actually really challenging. And I want to share some neurobiology to explain this. It's called neuroplasticity, and you'll be familiar with this. But for the listeners, neuroplasticity at a baseline is the brain's ability to remold, to reshape itself at any time right up until the day we die. And so leaders need to remind ourselves that we can teach new language, new habits, new skills to our direct reports, to the entire organization, to be shared, to be actioned, to be understood. And when we do that, we close that gap. We build that connectedness. We increase the ability for our brains to build new neurological connections in ways that weren't there before, right? Our brains are very malleable. And so we need to leverage the brain's ability. And we need to, as leaders, think about how do we send reward signals to our team members to keep them in a toward state so that they're not in a threat state and they're not in survival mode, so they can listen, they can learn, they can connect with others. Because I can tell you, in March of 2020, my brain's ability to connect and really listen to others was at an all-time low, if not zero.
Sure.
Because I was so focused on where can I get food from for my family this week while everybody's emergency shopping. Right?
Sure. That makes sense. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Amy. She was one of the, she wrote an endorsement for my book with, so she's a great person and a very respected scholar. Yeah. Now, you've talked about a lot of techniques. Now, let's go back to the institution, the NeuroLeadership Institute, that helped create these techniques. Tell me a little bit more about the NeuroLeadership Institute, your clients, who you work with, and how you come up with these techniques.
Yeah, thanks, Gleb. Happy to share that. Something I'm very passionate about in my role. So the NLI, the NeuroLeadership Institute, we're truly a global organization. We're across 24 different countries. And really, we're really dedicated to making, I would say, organizations more human through science, right? So understanding what we know about the human brain, how it functions, and then how do we translate that knowledge and that research into human daily practice, into habit adoption, behavior change, right? And so we work with 62% of the Fortune 100 companies. And essentially, we partner with them to develop their leaders and to transform their culture. More than 2 million employees at over 180 organizations have new habits as a result of working with us. So that's really exciting. It gets me out of bed every morning. Actually, in one study I can share with you, Gleb, we saw 78% of 9,500 participants across 30 different organizations deliberately mitigating biases as a result of working with us every single week. So applying a new behavior, a new habit, let's say, to making decisions or to building psychological safety, right, on 2 to 3 times a week, which was very powerful.
Yeah, it is.
And so for me, that's like the hallmark of truly systemic change in organizations at scale. And so to summarize that, I think what we do is we aim to transform leadership through the application of neuroscience and research. And so we enable leaders to facilitate what we call insights in the human brain, right? On having better conversations, breaking the biases you and I have been talking about today, being more inclusive, right? Having a growth mindset, learning to ask for feedback, using a science-based approach. All of these are kind of, I would say, the cornerstones of what we do within the organization.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that really valuable information about hybrid work and remote work and how the NeuroLeadership Institute can help facilitate new leadership in this world. Are there any last thoughts that you want to leave our audience with, Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Gleb. This has been a really rich conversation for me. In parting words, I would say to anybody listening to this, let's rise to the challenge. I'm deeply passionate about changing leadership across every industry and every organization, as are you, Gleb. And by doing so, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to the mediocrity we're seeing in the post-pandemic era, this quiet quitting, people just getting by. And so how do we re-energize, reconnect, tune into other people's experiences so that we can really amplify the quality of the work that we're seeing in organizations and really shifting from not just business outcomes, but finding the balance between business outcomes and human-centric outcomes, right? So really, let's reinvest. And this is to all HR leaders, CHROs, CEOs. Please think about where is your attention being in your investment in your people and building them new skill sets, future-proofing them for this post-pandemic era. Thanks, Gleb.
You're welcome, Matt. And I think that's really important. Business outcomes are very much aligned with people outcomes. When you look at the top concerns of leaders, talent acquisition, talent retention is a top concern. I just saw a new survey coming out from Vistage, the global CEO peer executive group, which shows that talent acquisition and retention is their top concern heading into the new year. So that's definitely a major issue. Thank you for bringing that up and connecting those two. Thank you, Matt. And thank you to everyone else who has checked out this podcast. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you checked it out and leave a review. It really helps us improve the show and it helps other people discover the show. Well, I hope you found this episode useful and I will look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. In the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.